The cheese smelled like a battlefield, and Marcus Webb thought that was probably the point. He held the wedge up to the light, a pale, blue-veined block of gorgonzola, rind still dusted with the white bloom of controlled mold, and watched the 3 Galactic Health Directorate inspectors across the conference table recoil as a single organism. Their chairs scraped backward in unison. The one in the center, a tall Marathi with translucent skin and organs visible like shadows beneath ice, pressed a cloth to the lower slits of her breathing apparatus and made a sound that the translation collar rendered as, "That substance is classified biohazard tier 4. Marcus set the cheese down on the table, very gently, and smiled. "It's lunch," he said. The incident that eventually became known as the Kalin hearings, though nobody called them that at the time, because at the time nobody knew who Kalin actually was, began 6 weeks before Marcus walked into that conference room with a cheese board. It began with a directive. The Galactic Health Directorate, Sector 9 Division, issued Order 7741C on a Tuesday morning, which Marcus always felt was appropriate, because nothing that ruined a person's life should be allowed to happen on a Monday. Order 7741C mandated the immediate suspension of all human food product exports to 11 member systems of the Galactic Compact, pending a comprehensive review of Earth's food safety protocols and the alarming prevalence of intentional biological contamination in human dietary practices. Intentional biological contamination. Marcus had read that phrase 4 times before he understood it. They meant fermentation. They meant his mother's sourdough starter, which she'd kept alive in a crock on the counter for 31 years and which Marcus had inherited when she died, and which he still fed every Friday morning with flour and water, the way she'd taught him, the way her mother had taught her. They meant the kombucha he drank every afternoon, the wine in his fridge, the miso paste he stirred into everything, the aged cheddar he'd eaten since childhood, the yogurt, the kimchi, the sauerkraut. Intentional biological contamination. "Right," Marcus said aloud to his empty office and reached for his jacket. His official title was Senior Zenobio Commerce Compliance Officer, which was the kind of bureaucratic mouthful that explained why everyone just called him Marcus. He worked for the Earth Compact Trade Liaison Bureau, a small and underfunded office wedged between a coffee shop and a translation services firm on the 14th floor of a building in Geneva that smelled perpetually of both. His job was, in theory, to ensure that Earth's food exports met the health and safety requirements of the 11 trading partner civilizations of the Galactic Compact. In practice, it meant a lot of form filling, a lot of interspecies video calls during which someone would inevitably have a catastrophic translation failure, and occasional trips to the Directorate's regional hub on Meridian Station to argue with people who had never seen a grape and yet felt very confident in their opinions about wine. He had made that trip 4 times in the past 3 years. He knew the corridors of Meridian Station the way a man knows a dentist's waiting room, familiar, unwelcoming, and always a prelude to something unpleasant. He booked his transit that afternoon. His assistant, a young woman named Rhea, who handled most of the actual work and was going to be very good at this job once she stopped being terrified of it, looked up from her desk when he came out of his office with his travel bag. "The Directorate called again," she said. "I know. They said Earth's file has been elevated to the Provisional Contamination Registry." "I know that too." "Marcus," she set down her stylus. "The Provisional Contamination Registry is step 2 of a 5-step process that ends with full trade embargo. Nobody has ever been moved off the registry once they're on it. The Directorate has never reversed a food safety ruling, not once in 60 years of operation." He paused at the door, looked back at her. "Rhea," he said, "have you ever had gorgonzola?" She stared at him. "What?" "Blue cheese. I'll explain on the way. Pack a bag, you're coming with me. The regional hub occupied a converted asteroid at the edge of the Meridian system, which someone had decided to rename Meridian Station approximately 40 years ago, when the Galactic Compact began using it as a neutral administrative center, and which still felt, in every corridor and waiting room, exactly like what it was. A rock that had been hollowed out by people who were very enthusiastic about ventilation systems and very uninterested in windows. Marcus had never gotten used to the smell of the place. Alien environments didn't smell bad, exactly. The olfactory experience was more like your nose receiving signals it had no filing system for, and simply returning them as static. He'd learned to breathe through his mouth in the first hour and stop thinking about it after that. The directorate's offices were on level 6. Marcus checked in at the reception desk, a 6-foot slab of engineered quartz staffed by a Valori assistant, whose 8 fingers moved across the intake form with practiced efficiency, and was told that Chief Director Kalen would see him the following morning at the 3rd hour of the administrative cycle, which the translation caller informed him was approximately 9 a.m. He was given a visitor's badge and a small pamphlet on directorate protocols, which he read in the elevator, and which contained a section on the importance of respecting scientific consensus in food safety determinations, that he read twice, and then folded very carefully and placed in his jacket pocket, because he had learned long ago that the things that made him angry were worth keeping close. Rhea met him in the corridor outside their assigned guest quarters, her own badge slightly askew, her expression carrying the specific tension of someone who had just discovered that the thing they'd been warned about is significantly worse than advertised. "I found the published report," she said, holding out her tablet. "The scientific basis for Order 7741C, the one that classified human fermentation practices as biohazard Tier 4. He took the tablet, read the executive summary, read it again. "This was authored by the Institute for Xenobiothermal Research," he said. "Yes." "Which is chaired by Director Kalen." "Yes." "Who is also the Chief Director of the Galactic Health Directorate." "Yes." "The person who issued the order that he also authored the scientific basis for." "Yes." Rhea took the tablet back. "There's more. The Institute is 6 years old. It was founded and funded by a private commercial entity called Vethari Consolidated, which holds the licensing rights to approximately 64% of all preserved food products currently approved for trade across compact member systems. If human fermented goods are banned, Vethari's market share jumps to 90%, Marcus said. He wasn't guessing. He'd seen this before in smaller ways in smaller rooms. The mechanism was always the same. Someone stands in front of a podium and says the word science with great confidence, and the people in the room defer, and the people who made the podium very quietly begin counting their money. "There's something else," Rhea said. She hesitated, the specific hesitation of someone unsure whether what they've found is real or a mistake. "The Institute's laboratory staff, the research team who actually ran the tests, I can't find any public record of them. Not their names, not their credentials, not their institutional affiliations. For a published scientific report, that's unusual," Marcus said. "I was going to say impossible." He was quiet for a moment, standing in the slightly too cold corridor of a hollowed-out asteroid, holding his travel bag, thinking about his mother's sourdough starter sitting on the counter back home, because Rhea was feeding it while he was gone and he'd written her very careful instructions. "Right," he said again, "let's find the laboratory." The directorate's published floor plans showed the Institute for Xenobiothermal Research occupying Level 8, Subsection C. What the floor plans did not show, what Marcus discovered at approximately 11 o'clock that night, when he told Rhea to stay in their quarters and instead walked the maintenance corridors of Level 8 for 40 minutes with a borrowed station schematic and a great deal of patience, was that subsection C was significantly larger than it appeared on any official document. The door at the end of the maintenance corridor wasn't locked. That surprised him. In his experience, things being hidden were either locked heavily or not at all, because the people doing the hiding either thought about it or didn't, and the ones who didn't were always the more dangerous, because it meant they weren't worried about being found. He pushed the door open. The room beyond was maybe 30 meters across, lit by rows of bioluminescent panels in a blue-white spectrum that made everything look like the inside of a medical scan. Equipment lined the walls, consoles and projection arrays, and something in the center of the room that Marcus recognized only after a moment of staring as a haptic projection rig. A full-body holographic puppetry system, the kind used in entertainment and high-end commercial presentations to animate synthetic spokespersons. The kind used to create a person who didn't exist. There were 7 of them. They sat at the control stations around the projection rig, small, gray-skinned beings with large dark eyes and elongated fingers, each wearing a headset and a neural interface collar that Marcus recognized with a cold and immediate certainty as a control restraint, not a communication device. The collars were anchoring them, not connecting them. The difference was in the design, the placement, the small red indicators that pulsed with a regular rhythm that matched nothing biological. They were working. They were working in silence, their fingers moving across interfaces with exhausted, mechanical precision, and none of them looked up when he opened the door. One of them was not working. One sat slightly apart from the others, her station dark, her head bowed, and when Marcus took a step into the room, something in the change of air pressure or the sound of his footfall or perhaps just the particular quality of human presence reached her, and she looked up. Her eyes were very large and very dark, the iris a deep amber that caught the blue-white light and threw it back warm. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they've seen before only in a warning, with recognition and with fear. She was the most alien-looking of the 7. Higher forehead, broader cranium, the gray skin mottled at the temples with a faint bioluminescence of her own, a species indicator, Marcus guessed, or an emotional one. Her collar was identical to the others. Her station was dark because he realized after a moment it was broken. The interface had cracked. He could see the fracture from here, and nobody had repaired it, which meant she had been sitting in this room unable to work, with nothing to do but think. He crossed to her in 3 steps, crouched to her eye level, and kept his voice very low. "Can you understand me?" he said. The translation collar he was wearing, standard Directorate visitor equipment, picked up her response before she'd finished making it, so the rendered words arrived slightly ahead of the motion of her speaking. "You are human." "Yes." "You should not be here." "Probably not," he agreed. "Can you tell me your name?" A long pause. The other 6 had not reacted. They were either unaware of him, or they'd learned not to react to things. He wasn't sure which was worse. "Vela," she said finally. "Marcus." He didn't offer his hand. He'd learned enough about contact protocols across species to know that some of them found it alarming. He simply stayed crouched at her level with his hands visible. "You're Vrith." Her expression shifted in a way that the translation collar couldn't decode, something in the set of the jaw, the slight widening of the amber eyes. "How do you know that?" "I work in Zenobio Commerce Compliance. I know a lot of species biology. The Vrith are biochemists. Your species has the most sophisticated understanding of molecular interaction in the known compact. You're the only civilization that has independently developed every fermentation process humanity uses." He paused. "Which is probably why you're here." The bioluminescence at her temples flickered, dim, then bright, then dim again. "We did not come willingly," she said. "I know." He looked at the collar. "How long?" 3 of your years." 3 years. The Institute was 6 years old, so there had been another group before this one, or the collars had been refined, or, It didn't matter, not right now. What mattered was the door at the other end of the room, and whether there was anyone on the other side of it. "Is there anyone else in this section?" he asked. "2 guards. They cycle at," she paused, calculating something, "in approximately 40 of your minutes." 40 minutes. Less than that now. "The control rig in the center," Marcus said. "That's Director Kalen." "There is no Director Kalen," she said, with a flatness that would have been contempt if the exhaustion underneath it hadn't hollowed it out. "There is a projection. We operate it. We have been operating it for 3 years. Everything the director has said, every ruling, every report, every public statement, we wrote it and we performed it and we put the correct face on it, and we were told that if the work was good we would go home." She stopped. The amber eyes held his for a moment. "We have been told that many times," she said. Marcus sat back on his heels. He looked at the room, the 7 beings in their collars, the broken console, the projection rig with its current render sitting dark and dormant, the director's face suspended in standby like a mask on a hook, and he felt the particular cold clarity that came over him sometimes in rooms like this, when a thing he'd suspected became a thing he knew. "I'm going to need your help," he said, "all of you." The bioluminescence at her temples had steadied. She was watching him with an expression the translation collar rendered, somewhat inadequately, as calculating. But there was something else in it too, something the collar couldn't parse. Something that looked, provisionally and with obvious reservations, like it might be deciding something. "You are here about the food rulings," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Your civilization's food practices." Her voice had a careful quality now, the same quality he'd heard before in alien scientists when they were managing their own contempt. The deliberate cultivation of microbial communities, the intentional introduction of fungal colonies into food material, the consumption of, she paused, and he could see her searching for a translation, decomposed milk solids. "Cheese," Marcus said. "The compounds produced by those processes are, in many cases, toxic to the Marathi respiratory system and several other compact physiologies. The original research was not entirely fabricated. The danger is real for some species, but not for all of them." "No. And the ban covers all of them." "Yes. Because Vethari Consolidated needed the market share." A pause. "The parameters we were given," she said carefully, "were designed to produce a specific conclusion. We were scientists. Another pause longer, we produced the work we were ordered to produce. Some of us told ourselves that there was a legitimate public health basis, that we were protecting species who genuinely could not tolerate human biologics." She looked at her dark console. "I stopped telling myself that in the 2nd year." Marcus said nothing for a moment. Through the door, somewhere down the corridor, he could hear the distant hum of station ventilation systems. 40 minutes had become maybe 30. "Vela," he said, "I need you to run the director tomorrow morning. I need you to bring him into the hearing room where I'm scheduled to meet with him, and I need him to be cooperative." The amber eyes didn't change. "Cooperative. I need him to show me the laboratory." She was quiet for long enough that he started counting the seconds. The other 6 continued working, their fingers moving in the blue-white light, their collars pulsing their small red rhythms. "If we are caught," she said, "it will not be good for us." "No," he agreed, "it probably won't. You understand that we have no reason to trust you." "Yes. You are human. Your species' food practices are the subject of a directorate investigation that she stopped, that we designed to eliminate you from the market. You have personal and professional reasons to resent us." "I have professional reasons," Marcus said. "The personal ones are more complicated. My mother kept a sourdough starter alive for 31 years. She fed it every Friday. She left it to me when she died, and I've kept feeding it every Friday since. If the ban holds, I can't bring flour or starter culture to any compact trading post. I can't share something she gave me with any world outside this one. He paused. I don't resent you for the ruling. I know you didn't write it for yourselves. The bioluminescence at her temples had shifted, a warmer frequency, he thought, though he wasn't certain if that meant anything. What is a sourdough starter? She asked. It's a culture, he said. Wild yeast and bacteria. You feed it flour and water and in return it ferments, makes bread rise, makes it taste like, he searched for a description, like something that's been alive a long time. You can taste the time in it. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Biochemically, she said, that is a symbiotic colony, a maintained, multi-generational microbial ecosystem. Yes, which a human family has sustained across, you said 31 years. Plus my grandmother's years before that. We don't know when she started it. The amber eyes did something the translation collar again could not quite decode. That is not primitive, she said very quietly. That is what my species would call living culture husbandry. It requires precision, patience, and a deep understanding of, she stopped herself, started again. Humans are not supposed to understand fermentation at that level. We've been doing it for 10,000 years, Marcus said. We just don't have the theoretical framework to explain it in terms your reports would recognize. Doesn't mean we don't know what we're doing. He stood up. His knees ached. He was 43 and the floors of Meridian Station were unforgiving, and he looked at the door and then back at her. I'll be in the hearing room at the 3rd administrative hour, he said. If you run the director, I'll do the rest. And if we do this, she said, and it works, what happens to us? He looked at her collar again. I can't promise anything that depends on other people keeping promises. What I can promise is that I'll tell anyone who will listen what I found in this room, and I'll keep telling them until someone with actual authority does something about it. That's not a guarantee. It's just, he thought of Rhea, back in the guest quarters, with her tablet and her careful certainty that things that had never happened before couldn't happen. It's what I've got. The bioluminescence pulsed once, steadily. 3rd administrative hour, Vela said. I will need time to brief the others. Marcus didn't sleep. He sat in the guest quarters with Rhea, who had not stayed in the guest quarters, and who had apparently used the hours since his departure to hack the directorate's administrative scheduling system, which she explained by saying she'd learned from a course she'd taken on her own time, and Marcus decided this was the moment to give her a raise. I've cross-referenced the Institute's published research with the independent Zenobia thermal literature, she said, spreading documents across the room's small table. There are 47 compact scientists who have published on human fermentation products in the last decade. 42 of them found no significant risk to the majority of compact species. The 5 who found risk all found it in the same 2 species, the Merathi and the Lori, and all 5 recommended targeted warnings rather than a blanket ban. Vethari Consolidated funded 3 of those 5. 4 actually. I found the 4th one in the grant records. She looked up. Marcus, this isn't just corruption. This is a constructed consensus. Someone built a false scientific reality and then used the directorate's authority to make it the only one that counted. Someone, he agreed. How do we prove it? He told her what he'd found in subsection C. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. Not the silence of someone processing information. She was fast, always. But the silence of someone deciding where to put a thing they hadn't had a category for until now. The beings in those collars, she said finally. They're the ones who wrote the reports. Yes. So the reports are scientifically legitimate. The Vrith are the best biochemists in the compact, but the parameters were designed to produce the outcome Vethari needed. Yes. And the director who issued the ruling, the person who is the public face of the entire directorate, doesn't exist. He's a projection operated by enslaved scientists. Rhea was quiet for another moment. All right, she said. What do we need for the morning? He looked at his travel bag, sitting open on the bed. A cheese board, he said. And a signal relay. The hearing room on level 6 was exactly what Marcus had expected. A long table of engineered composite, 6 chairs on one side for the directorate delegation, 1 chair on the other for him. The room had the specific design of spaces built for pronouncements rather than conversations. The directorate side slightly elevated, the air slightly cooler on the single chair, the lighting calibrated to make the person across the table look very small. He arrived early and rearranged the room. Not dramatically. He just moved his chair to the side of the table rather than across from it, which nobody had told him he couldn't do, and he placed his bag on the table rather than on the floor, and he laid out a small cutting board with 6 wedges of cheese and a sleeve of crackers that he'd bought at the transit hub and which had survived the journey in his bag remarkably well. Rhea was outside in the corridor with her tablet, connected via a relay she'd established overnight to the Directorate's Level 8 ventilation monitoring system, which had turned out to share a network node with the laboratory's internal feeds. The Vrith control stations, once you knew which channel to look for, were broadcasting clearly. The director arrived at the 3rd hour precisely. Joseph Surf had been a reclusive tech entrepreneur with a skiing accident in his past that explained his reluctance to appear in public until his product line demanded it. Kalen was a different construct, older, grander, the face of institutional authority rather than commercial charm. A broad, heavily ridged Marathi face, deep-set eyes, the slow, deliberate movements of someone who has never been in a hurry because they have never needed to be. He moved to his chair on the elevated side of the table, settled into it with the practiced weight of a person accustomed to rooms that arranged themselves around them, and looked across at Marcus with the patient expression of someone about to deliver a conclusion rather than hold a conversation. He looked, Marcus thought, exactly like a person who knew the verdict before the trial. "Mr. Webb," Kalen said. The translation collar rendered the voice warm, authoritative, confident. "I appreciate your traveling to address these concerns directly. The Directorate takes all representations from affected parties seriously." "Thank you," Marcus said. He picked up a wedge of gorgonzola and held it up. The 2 Marathi aides flanking Kalen recoiled. The director's expression flickered, a slight distortion at the edges, there and gone, and for just a moment the face did not quite match the movement of the words. Marcus had been watching for it. Vela had told him what to look for. "This is Gorgonzola," Marcus said, "named after a town in northern Italy on Earth. The blue-green veins you can see are from a fungal culture, Penicillium glaucum. Farmers discovered this process centuries ago when they noticed that cheese stored in caves naturally developed these cultures, and that the result was not just safe to eat but actively more nutritious than uncultured cheese. The penicillium produces compounds that inhibit certain pathogenic bacteria. We've been using it deliberately ever since." He set it down. "The compounds your report classified as biohazard Tier 4 are those same penicillium metabolites. They're hazardous to Marathi respiratory physiology specifically, because of your species' gill structure sensitivity to volatile organics. For the other 9 member systems in the band, they're harmless or mildly beneficial." Kalen's face did not change. The Directorate's findings represent the consensus of. The Directorate's findings were authored by 7 Vrith scientists currently being held in your Level 8 laboratory, Marcus said. He kept his voice level, not aggressive, level. The way his mother had taught him to disagree with powerful people, back when she was alive and he was young, and she was trying to give him every tool she could for a world that would not always be kind to the tools she'd given him. The Institute for Xenobiothermal Research doesn't have a physical staff. You are a holographic projection operated by those 7 people. Your existence is a construction funded by Vethari, consolidated to legitimize a market capture operation disguised as public health policy. He put his tablet on the table and turned it to face the director. On the screen, very clearly, was Ria's relay feed from Level 8. 7 Vrith scientists at their stations, collars illuminated, the control rig at the center of the room casting the director's image across the table in front of Marcus at this exact moment. The face on the screen, the face across the table, identical. One of them was real. The face across the table flickered again. This time it didn't recover immediately. For 3 seconds it pixelated at the edges, the confident Marathi features fragmenting into the underlying light data before snapping back. The 2 aides looked at the director, then at each other. The scientific basis for Order 7741C, Marcus continued, was produced under coercion by the leading biochemical researchers in the compact, forced to design their findings around a conclusion they were given rather than a question they were asked. 3 of them had independent research, pre-captivity, that directly contradicted the findings they were forced to produce. I have those papers. He slid copies across the table, actual paper copies, because he'd learned that in rooms like this, where things were easily altered and records were easily adjusted, something that required a human hand and a printer was harder to claim had never existed. I also have the funding records for the Institute, the incorporation documents for Vethari consolidated, and a sworn statement from one of the Vrith scientists in Level 8 that I obtained last night. He hadn't told Vela he was going to call it a sworn statement. He thought she'd understand if it came to that. The face across the table had gone very still. The kind of still that was not stillness but suspension, a projection waiting for an input that wasn't coming. The aides were standing now. I'm going to need the collars removed, Marcus said, and I'm going to need the 7 scientists in Level 8 released to Vrith diplomatic care. And I'm going to need to speak with whatever actual person is responsible for the Vethari connection before I decide how much of this I'm releasing to compact-wide media, which I have relationships with, because I've been in this job for 11 years, and I know every journalist who covers the trade beat in 6 systems. He paused. Or we can do this the other way, where I walk out of here and the feed my colleague is currently transmitting goes live on the compact public network, and the directorate explains to 11 member governments why their food safety rulings were produced by slaves. The face across the table flickered one more time. Then it went out. The projection collapsed, not dramatically, not with sound or spectacle, just a sudden absence of the construct that had occupied the chair, a chair that was now simply empty. The chair on an elevated platform in a room designed for pronouncements, now occupied by nothing, casting no shadow, holding no weight. One of the aides made a sound that the translation caller rendered as, "This cannot be." "It can," Marcus said. "It is." He picked up the gorgonzola again, cut himself a small piece with the cheese knife he'd packed alongside it, placed it on a cracker, and ate it. It tasted, as it always did, like something that had been alive a long time and kept alive carefully. He chewed and swallowed and looked at the empty chair. "I'll need someone with actual authority to speak to," he said. "Take as long as you need." It took 4 hours. The actual person with authority turned out to be a mid-level administrator named Counselor Dethos, a gray-jowled bureaucrat who arrived flanked by legal representatives, and who had the look of a person who had spent the last 4 hours deciding how much to sacrifice in order to preserve everything else. He offered, in order, a modified version of the order limiting the ban to species with demonstrated sensitivity, a full review of the Directorate's research protocols, and the removal of the Vrith scientists' control collars, subject to a confidentiality agreement. Marcus had brought Ria into the room by that point. She sat beside him with her tablet and her immaculate documentation, and the specific expression of someone who had passed through terror into a kind of professional serenity on the other side. "No confidentiality agreement," Marcus said on the last point. Without it, the Directorate cannot. The Directorate cannot continue to pretend an enslaved research team is its scientific consensus. Yes, that's correct. He looked at Dethos. The collars come off. The scientists are released. Vrith diplomatic representatives are notified today. The scientific record is corrected. Trade in human fermented products resumes for the 9 systems with no demonstrated sensitivity, with clearly labeled advisories for Marathi and the Lori consumers. Dethos looked at his legal representatives. They looked at Marcus. Marcus waited. The collars, Dethos said finally, will be removed today. Vela was the last one to have hers taken off. She'd asked to be last. Marcus didn't know why, but he'd made sure he was in the room when it happened. Level 8, subsection C, the blue-white bioluminescent light, the projection rig dark and dormant in the center. The other 6 Vrith scientists standing in a loose group near the door with the Vrith diplomatic representative who had arrived, with impressive speed, 40 minutes after Ria's notification went through. The technician who removed the collars, the Lori from the Directorate's own technical staff, who had the demeanor of someone performing a task they wished very much was someone, brought a small device to Vela's collar, pressed it against the locking mechanism, and there was a soft click. The collar fell. She caught it in both hands. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it down on the dark console, her console, the broken one, and looked up. The bioluminescence at her temples was doing something Marcus had not seen before. A rapid, complex patterning that moved from cool blue to warm amber and back again, cycling faster than he could follow. "You should go with the others," he said. In a moment, she looked at him. "You ate the cheese." "Yes." "In the hearing room. While the projection was still running, you simply ate it. It was good cheese. I'd had it in my bag for 2 days. It was starting to get warm." The bioluminescence steadied into the warm amber register. "I thought," she said, "that you were making a demonstration, a deliberate display of confidence." "It was also that," he admitted. "You are strange," she said. "Humans are strange. Your relationship with biological processes is not what I was told, what I wrote in those reports. I wrote things I knew were misleading about species that did not understand what they were working with. But you," she stopped. "A maintained multi-generational microbial ecosystem," she said, "for 31 years. Plus the grandmother's years before." "Yes." "What is the current state of the culture? Is it healthy?" He thought about Ria, back on Earth, feeding the starter on Fridays with careful instructions. "As far as I know," he said. "When you return to Earth," she said, "I would like to." She stopped again. The amber bioluminescence pulsed steadily. The Vrith scientific community has studied human fermentation literature for decades. We could never obtain samples for direct study because of the trade restrictions. With those restrictions lifted. "I'll send you a sample," Marcus said. "Starter and culture both, as much as you want." She looked at him for a long moment. The amber light at her temples was very steady now, and warm. 3 years, she said. "We were told we would go home if the work was good. We never went home." "I know. I wrote reports saying your food was dangerous. Reports that would have ended your civilization's access to markets it depends on." She looked at the collar on the console. "And you came into this room at night, and you crouched down to my eye level, and you kept your hands where I could see them." He didn't say anything. "That is not what I was told humans do," she said. "People tell you a lot of things," Marcus said. "Some of them are even trying to be accurate." The diplomatic representative appeared at the doorway then, with the gentle urgency of a person managing a schedule. Vela looked at him, then back at Marcus. "I will accept the culture sample," she said. "I would like to study the sourdough specifically. A multi-generational maintained symbiotic colony is," she paused. "It is the kind of thing my people spend careers trying to design. And yours simply passed it down, family to family. without even knowing what it was. "We knew what it was," Marcus said. "We just called it something different." She looked at him for the last time then, with the amber eyes and the steady warm light at her temples, and the expression that the translation collar had never quite managed, across the entire night and day, to render adequately. It was not the expression she'd had when he first came into the room. That one had been fear and recognition, and the specific readiness of someone expecting to be used. This one was different. He didn't have a word for it, in English or in the collar's translation bank, but he thought it was probably in the vicinity of a person recalibrating the contents of a category they'd thought was settled. "Your people," she said, "have been eating living things for 10,000 years. "Yes." "You have been," she searched, "keeping them alive and working with them and sharing them across generations." "Yes." "That is not primitive," she said. "That is a relationship." She went through the door with the diplomatic representative. Marcus stood in the empty laboratory for a moment, looking at the dark console with the collar sitting on it and the dormant projection rig in the center of the room, and then he picked up the collar and carried it out with him, because he didn't want to leave it behind. 3 weeks later, the correction to Order 7741C went into effect. Targeted advisories for Marathi and the Lori consumers. Full restoration of trade access for the other 9 member systems. A mandatory review of the Directorate's research independence protocols, which took the form of a committee and would probably take years and might or might not produce anything real, because that was how institutions worked, and Marcus had no illusions about them. The formal investigation into Vethari Consolidated's funding of the Institute and the captivity of the Vrith research team was opened by the Galactic Compact's Oversight Division, which was slow but thorough, and Dethos retired on medical grounds 2 weeks after that, which Marcus considered a modest form of justice. Rhea got her raise. She also got a commendation from the Trade Liaison Bureau Director, which she accepted with the expression of someone who understood that the commendation was partly the Bureau congratulating itself, but who was also, underneath that, quietly and genuinely pleased. Marcus sat in his office in Geneva on a Friday morning and fed the starter. Flour and water, the same proportions his mother had used and her mother before her. He worked the mixture in with his hands and felt the temperature of it and smelled the sharp, alive, slightly sweet smell of the ferment doing what it had always done, what it would keep doing as long as someone remembered to feed it. On his desk was a message from Dr. Vela via the Vrith Scientific Exchange. It was brief, professional. It said that the starter culture he'd sent had arrived safely, and that preliminary analysis confirmed an active multi-generational colony with significant biological diversity, and that the Vrith Institute of Living Systems had accepted it for long-term study, and that they were very grateful, and that this was the last line, and it didn't quite match the register of the rest of the message. The cheese was also remarkable. He had sent her a wedge of the gorgonzola, wrapped carefully for transit, with a note explaining the caves and the penicillium, and the farmers who had learned centuries ago that the right kind of rot was not rot at all. He read the message twice. Then he set his phone down and looked out the window at Geneva in the early morning, the lake silver and flat, the city waking up, the ordinary morning of an ordinary world that had been making extraordinary things for 10,000 years and hadn't always known to call it that. He took the lid off the crock and looked at the starter, active, bubbling faintly, alive in the particular way that things kept alive by attention and care are alive, and thought about his mother, and about a dark laboratory-lit blue-white, and about amber eyes reconsidering a conclusion they'd held for 3 years. He put the lid back on. "Still good," he said, to no one in particular. Outside, Geneva was getting on with its morning. The lake caught the light. Somewhere in a Vrith laboratory several light-years away, a culture his grandmother had started was being studied by the best biochemists in the known galaxy, and a scientist who had spent 3 years in a collar was learning, in her own clinical and precise and slightly astonished way, what it meant to keep something alive for a very long time. He put the kettle on. He had a lot of paperwork to file. The paperwork turned out to be substantial. Marcus had known it would be. 11 years in Zenobio commerce compliance had given him a precise internal sense of how much paperwork any given event would generate, scaled to the number of systems involved, the number of regulatory bodies affected, and the degree to which the event had required him to do things that were technically within the scope of his authorization, but that nobody in his office had specifically anticipated when they wrote his job description. The Kalin situation, as Rhea had taken to calling it, not the Kalin hearings, which was what the Compact Oversight Committee's formal filing called it, but simply the Kalin situation, in the same tone of voice one might use for the leaky pipe in the bathroom, generated approximately 4 times the paperwork of any previous event in his career. He filed it all. He had help. Rhea had begun, in the weeks since their return, to carry herself differently. Not dramatically, she wasn't a dramatic person, but there was a quality to how she moved through the office now that hadn't been there before. A steadiness. She still triple-checked everything, but the checking had changed character. It was no longer the checking of someone who didn't trust themselves, but the checking of someone who had learned that their work mattered enough to be worth checking. Marcus noticed this the way he noticed most things. Quietly, without comment, and with a satisfaction that he kept to himself because commenting on it would have embarrassed them both. The Vrith diplomatic situation resolved with more speed than Marcus had expected and considerably more grace than the situation probably deserved. The Galactic Compact's Oversight Division had, in the event, proven to be faster and less committee-bound than its reputation suggested, possibly because the story, 7 enslaved alien scientists, a fake director, a market capture scheme spanning 6 years and 11 systems, was so clean in its wrongness that it left very little room for the kind of jurisdictional ambiguity that usually slowed oversight processes to a geological crawl. Counselor Dethos's retirement, Marcus later learned, had been less voluntary than announced. He did not feel particularly moved by this information. Vethari Consolidated was a more complicated matter. Large commercial entities with 11 systems worth of market share and a century of operational infrastructure do not unravel quickly, and the Compact's commercial law was, like all Compact law, a negotiated document that had been negotiated by parties with conflicting interests, and which therefore contained, at various critical points, passages that could be interpreted several ways. The investigation was ongoing. Marcus had provided his documentation. He had also provided, at the Oversight Division's request, the original pre-captivity research papers from 3 of the Vrith scientists, which contradicted the Directorate's findings more cleanly than anything else in the record. He had gotten those papers, he told the Oversight representative, from one of the scientists directly. The representative had asked him how he'd obtained access to the scientists. Marcus had said, "I knocked on a door that wasn't locked." The representative had written this down. Dr. Vela's first paper arrived in the Zenobio Commerce Office's scientific correspondence inbox 6 weeks after the events on Meridian Station. It was addressed to Marcus personally, which was slightly unusual for scientific correspondence, and was 43 pages long, which was not unusual for Vrith scientific work. They wrote long and thoroughly, and with a level of footnoting that suggested a profound distrust of anything not explicitly sourced. The paper was titled, "Maintained Symbiotic Microbial Colonies in Human Food Culture, a Multi-Generational Study of Sourdough, Kefir, and Associated Fermentation Practices, with Preliminary Analysis of Colony Diversity and Potential Xenobiochemical Applications." Marcus read the abstract, which was 3 pages long. Then he read the methodology, which described, in precise Vrith scientific language, the process of receiving a culture sample by diplomatic courier and establishing it in a controlled laboratory environment and feeding it, on a 7-day cycle, with flour and water at the proportions specified by the human who had provided it. Which was to say, every Friday. He read that section twice. Then he skipped to the conclusions, which were, by the standards of Vrith scientific writing, quite brief. They said, in summary, that the culture exhibited a degree of biological diversity and adaptive stability that exceeded anything the Vrith Institute had previously observed in artificially maintained colonies, that the evidence suggested this stability was a result of long-term selective pressure applied through consistent human care practices, that this represented a form of applied xenobiochemistry that the human civilization had been practicing for millennia without a formal theoretical framework to describe it, and that further study was urgently warranted. The last paragraph, the very last one, which was brief even by non-Vrith standards, said, "We note, additionally, that the secondary culture sample, the preserved fungal colony of Penicillium glaucum in aged milk solid, was examined independently and found to contain antibiotic precursor compounds of significant potential interest. This laboratory had not previously considered preserved human food products as a source of pharmacological material. We are reconsidering." Marcus read that paragraph 3 times. He thought about Alexander Fleming and the Petri dish and the mold that had killed the bacteria around it, which had been the beginning of antibiotics on Earth, which had been one of the things that had saved more human lives than almost any other discovery in history. He thought about the penicillium in the gorgonzola, which was a relative of that mold. He thought about the caves in northern Italy where the farmers had learned, without knowing the mechanism, without any of the theoretical framework, that the right kind of fungus made the cheese safe and good and lasted longer in winter. He thought about what Vela had said, not primitive, a relationship. He printed the paper out, actual paper, because it was going in his files, and the files were physical, because he'd made that habit when he was new at this job, and a more experienced colleague had told him that physical records were the hardest kind to make disappear, and put it in the folder labeled KAELEN situation, which was already thick. Then he opened a message to Vela's research address and typed, "Received. The penicillium note made me laugh. I'll send you a proper explanation of Fleming and the Petri dish. You'll appreciate it. Also, you're feeding the starter every Friday, yes. 7-day cycle. Don't skip." He sent it before he could second-guess the tone, which he had found with experience was usually the right approach. Her reply came in 3 days, which was fast for interstellar correspondence. It said, "The 7-day cycle is maintained. The culture is well. We have established a monitoring protocol that 2 of our researchers have taken on as a primary responsibility. They are, I believe, becoming attached to it. I will review the Fleming material. As for the penicillium, we are running further tests. I will keep you informed." There was a second paragraph that was shorter than the first. "I have been asked by several of my colleagues to convey their interest in the possibility of a formal research exchange with human food scientists and microbiologists. The Vrith Institute has not previously engaged in direct collaborative work with human researchers. There have been assumptions, some mine, some my colleagues, about the level of theoretical sophistication we would encounter. The work in our laboratory over the past 6 weeks has caused some of those assumptions to be revised." She paused. He could feel the pause in the structure of the sentence, the specific place where a careful person chose their words precisely. "I would like to propose the exchange formally, if you are willing to facilitate an introduction." He stared at the message for a long moment. Then he wrote back, "I can introduce you to 3 people at the University of Edinburgh who work in microbial ecology, 1 person at MIT who studies fermentation genomics, and a woman in Osaka who has been maintaining her family's miso starter for 200 years, and who I am reasonably certain would be the most interesting conversation you have ever had." He paused, then added, "She also does not have a theoretical framework. She just knows what the miso needs." He scented. Then he got up and made himself a cup of tea with the good stuff, the aged pu'er that he'd been given by a colleague who knew his tastes, the kind of tea that had been compressed and stored for years and developed complexity through microbial fermentation. And he sat by the window and looked at Lake Geneva and thought about all the things his species had been doing for thousands of years without knowing the vocabulary for them. Rhea came to the doorway of his office. "You're smiling," she said, which was not something she usually commented on, which meant it was probably more visible than he realized. "AMI. You get that look when something's gone better than expected." "Things have gone better than expected." She leaned against the doorframe with her tablet under her arm, considering him. The Vrith exchange proposal. He looked at her. "How did you?" "You printed something out," she said. "You only print things out when they matter." He considered this. "Yes," he said, "the Vrith exchange, among other things." She was quiet for a moment, the way she'd gotten quiet lately, a thoughtful quiet rather than a careful one. "Marcus, what you said in the hearing room about your mother's starter, was that—" She stopped. "Was that what?" "Strategic. I mean, you said it to make a point. To tell the Vrith scientist that her work wasn't evil because her work was about something real. But was it also just true?" He thought about his mother's hands working the starter, Friday mornings, the kitchen smelling of flour, and the particular sharpness of the ferment. He thought about the crock in his apartment that had his name on it now. He thought about a culture sample wrapped carefully for interstellar transit, being fed on a 7-day cycle in a laboratory several light years away by researchers who had, perhaps, become attached to it. "Yes," he said, "both." She nodded, satisfied with this, the way she was satisfied when the documentation matched. "I've drafted the formal request to the Trade Liaison Bureau for authorization of the research exchange," she said. "It's on your desk." "Of course it is." "Also, there's a journalist from the Compact-Wide Press asking for comment on the Vethari investigation." "Tell them no comment, and then send them the public filings." "Already done." She pushed off the doorframe. "I'm going to send the Edinburgh contact your Vrith connection. Is that all right?" "Yes, copy Vela directly. She'll appreciate the efficiency." Rhea half-smiled, small, precise, very her, and went back to her desk. Marcus turned back to the window. The lake was doing what it always did, existing, quietly, silver-gray and patient, indifferent to the small dramas on its shores. He watched it for a while and thought about things that lasted, cultures and starters, and the long, patient accumulation of knowledge passed down through hands rather than written in papers, the kind of knowing that lives in the body rather than the library. His phone buzzed, a message from the Edinburgh contact, responding to Rhea's introduction faster than he'd expected. "Vrith scientists, seriously, Marcus, do you understand how long I have been trying to get Vrith Institute access? What did you do?" He typed back, "I took a cheese board to a hearing." The response came in 30 seconds. "Of course you did." 4 months after the events on Meridian Station, the Galactic Compact Oversight Division published its interim findings on the Kalen case. The document was long. Compact legal documents were always long and dense, and contained a number of passages that were, in Marcus's assessment, careful in ways that suggested the authors were still negotiating with several interested parties. But the core findings were clear. The Institute for Xenobiothermal Research had operated as a fraudulent entity. Its published research had been produced under conditions of coercion and could not be considered a legitimate scientific consensus. And Order 7741C was formally rescinded in its entirety and replaced with a species-differentiated advisory framework. Marcus read the document twice. He flagged 3 passages for Rhea and sent the public filing reference to Vela with a brief note. Her reply came the next morning. I have read the document, she wrote. The findings are thorough. I note that the recommendations for oversight reform are cautious. This is perhaps appropriate as compact institutions move carefully, but the core reversal is complete. A pause in the letter. I want to say something that is not easy precisely. The reports we wrote were technically accurate in their narrow scope. The compounds in question do interact badly with Marathi respiratory physiology, and the data was genuine. What we designed, under the parameters we were given, was a framing that made a narrow true thing function as a broad false one. I have spent the 4 months since Meridian Station thinking about that distinction, about what it means to produce true work in service of a false conclusion. Another pause. I am not sure what to do with that, but I am thinking about it. Marcus read this twice as well. Then he wrote, that's probably the right thing to do with it. Scientists in my species have a concept, Feynman's phrase. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. He said it about physics, but it applies everywhere. The difficulty is that the pressure to fool yourself when the alternative is a control collar is not a small one. He paused over his reply before sending it. You didn't fool yourself. You knew what you were doing in the second year. That's not absolution, and I don't think you're looking for it, but it's relevant. He sent it. Then he went home, and it was a Friday, and he fed the starter. The woman in Osaka, her name was Mrs. Tanaka, and she was 78 years old, and she had met Vela on a research video call that had lasted 3 hours, and which Ria had scheduled, and which Marcus had not attended because he suspected his presence was not what either of them needed, sent him a brief note afterward. Your alien friend, she wrote in the slightly formal English she used for professional correspondence, asked very good questions. She understood the miso immediately. She asked if I was lonely tending it for so many years. I said no, it is company. She did not think that was strange. I liked her. Marcus filed the note with the others. The folder labeled KALEN situation was very thick now. He would need to start a second folder soon, because the Vrith Research Exchange had generated its own paper trail, and the Edinburgh collaboration was producing preliminary data that was going to be published in 2 journals simultaneously, which was unusual. And Vela had asked, formally, through proper channels, through Ria who managed the correspondence, whether there was a possibility of a physical visit to Earth at some point to see the source materials directly. A Vrith scientist coming to Earth to study fermentation in person. He thought about that on the train home one evening, watching the landscape go by outside the window, the early autumn fields, the particular quality of the light at that hour. He thought about what she'd said, not primitive, a relationship. He thought about everything his species had been doing for thousands of years in kitchens and cellars and caves without calling it science, without calling it anything, just doing it because it worked, and because their parents had done it and their grandparents before that. He thought about what it would look like to an alien scientist seeing it for the first time. The sourdough starter in the crock, Mrs. Tanaka's miso in its ceramic vessels, the caves in northern Italy where the air moved in the right way for the penicillium to grow. 10,000 years of practice distilled into muscle memory and Friday mornings, and the particular smell of a kitchen that has been a kitchen for a long time. He would need to make sure the starter was in good shape before she came. He sent Ria a message. Block 2 days in the schedule for when the Vrith visit happens. I want to take her to meet Mrs. Tanaka in Osaka if she's willing. Ria replied in 4 minutes, already on the calendar. Mrs. Tanaka is aware and says, and I'm quoting directly, bring something to eat. Marcus laughed, actually laughed, alone in his train compartment, in a way that startled the person across the aisle into looking up from their book. He thought about a conference room on Meridian Station and a hologram dissolving, and the sound of a chair that no longer had anyone sitting in it. He thought about a collar falling and amber eyes, reconsidering everything they'd believed about the species now sitting across from them. He thought about the specific, stubborn human act of feeding something every week for 30 years, passing it forward, keeping it alive, trusting that the future would have a use for it even when you couldn't see exactly what that use would be. The train went on through the autumn fields. The light changed. Marcus sat with his travel bag in his lap and his paperwork on his tablet and his jacket on the seat beside him, and he looked out the window at the world going by and thought that he should probably get a bigger jar for the starter, because it was time to split the culture and give some away. It was, his mother had always said, the only way to keep it honest. You couldn't hoard a living thing, you had to share it forward. That was the whole point of it, that was the secret of the 10,000 years. That was the thing that no report full of narrow, true data had ever quite managed to capture. That the relationship worked because it went both ways. The culture fed you. You fed the culture. And somewhere down the line, something that started in a cave in northern Italy or a kitchen in Japan or a homestead anywhere on the old green earth arrived in a laboratory several light years away and startled a scientist into reconsidering the contents of a category she'd thought was settled. He put in his earbuds and listened to music the rest of the way home, because not everything needed to be a thought. Sometimes you just needed the train to go where it was going, and the light to do what light did in autumn, and the week ahead to be whatever it was going to be. On Friday, he would feed the starter. That was enough for now.